In the bitter winter of 1876, when the Montana Territory stretched endlessly under blankets of snow and the wind carried whispers of war between settlers and native tribes, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell found herself in a place no white woman had ever been before, lost, terrified, and clutching a Sioux child who called her mama in a language she barely understood. Sarah would discover that survival sometimes means becoming someone you never imagined you could be. What started as a simple journey to join her fiancé at Fort Benton would become a story of courage, cultural collision, and an unlikely bond that would challenge everything she believed about family, loyalty, and what it truly means to belong. This is the true account of how a bride-to-be became a bridge between two worlds at war, and how a desperate father's plea would forever change the course of her life. The frozen prairie held secrets that winter, and Sarah Mitchell was about to become one of them. Sarah Mitchell pulled her woolen shawl tight around her shoulders as the stagecoach bounced violently over another rut in the frozen ground. The Montana Territory in December 1876 was not kind to travelers, especially young women, making the journey alone. At 22, Sarah had the determined look of someone who had made up her mind about something important, even if that something terrified her. Her destination was Fort Benton, where her fiancé Thomas Hartwell waited with promises of marriage and a new life on the frontier. They had been corresponding for 8 months after meeting briefly in St. Louis, where Thomas had been visiting his sister. His letters painted pictures of wide open spaces, opportunity, and adventure that called to something restless in Sarah's spirit. Her family back in Ohio thought she was making a terrible mistake, but Sarah had always been the type to forge her own path. The stagecoach carried only 3 passengers that day. Besides Sarah, there was an older man named Bill Crawford, who claimed to be a cattle buyer, though his nervous glances and the way he clutched his leather satchel suggested he might be carrying something more valuable than business documents. The third passenger was a young married couple, the Hendersons, who were heading to Helena where the husband had secured work at a mining operation. The driver, a weathered man named Pete Morrison, had been making this route for 5 years. He knew every dangerous turn, every place where outlaws might wait, and every stream that could turn deadly in winter weather. Before they left the last way station, he had warned his passengers that this stretch of country was particularly unsettled. There had been reports of Sioux war parties moving through the area, and tensions were high following the defeat of General Custer at Little Bighorn just 6 months earlier. Sarah tried not to think about the dangers as she watched the endless white landscape roll past the small window. She focused instead on the letter from Thomas that she had read so many times. The paper was soft with handling. He wrote about the cabin he was building, about the garden they would plant in spring, about the children they would have and the life they would build together. It was a beautiful dream, and Sarah clung to it as the miles passed. The first sign of trouble came around midday, when Pete Morrison suddenly pulled the horses to a stop. Through the front of the coach, Sarah could hear him talking in low, urgent tones to someone outside. Bill Crawford immediately reached for the pistol he kept in his coat, while Mrs. Henderson grabbed her husband's arm with white knuckles. When Pete climbed down from his seat, his face was grim. 3 riders had approached them on the trail ahead, and they were not travelers seeking directions. They were Sioux warriors, painted for war, and they were blocking the path to Fort Benton. Pete had dealt with native tribes before, sometimes peacefully, but these men had the look of those who had already decided that any white faces they encountered would not be friendly ones. The leader of the 3 warriors was a man of perhaps 30 years, with intricate patterns painted on his face and chest despite the cold weather. He spoke some English, which he had learned through various encounters with traders and soldiers over the years. When Pete tried to negotiate safe passage, offering tobacco and food from their supplies, the warriors' response was immediate and non-negotiable. The white travelers would come with them, or they would die where they sat. Bill Crawford made the mistake of thinking his pistol gave him an advantage. The moment he raised it, an arrow struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the weapon flying into a snowbank. Mrs. Henderson screamed, and her husband tried to shield her with his body. Sarah found herself strangely calm, as if she were watching these events happen to someone else. The warriors took control quickly and efficiently. Pete was bound with rope, as were Mr. Henderson and the wounded Bill Crawford. Mrs. Henderson was tied to her husband, sobbing uncontrollably. But when they came to Sarah, something unexpected happened. The leader studied her face carefully, then spoke rapidly to his companions in their own language. After a brief discussion, they treated her differently than the others, binding her hands but allowing her to ride one of their horses instead of being forced to walk. As they left the stagecoach behind, Sarah caught a glimpse of Pete Morrison's face. He was a practical man who understood the ways of the frontier. and his expression told her everything she needed to know about their chances. Male prisoners might be kept alive if they proved useful. Women prisoners faced a more uncertain fate. Some were adopted into tribes, others were ransomed back to white settlements, and some simply disappeared into the vast wilderness, never to be seen again. The journey to the Sioux camp took 3 hours through increasingly difficult terrain. Sarah tried to memorize landmarks and directions, thinking she might need to find her way back alone if the opportunity presented itself. But the snow-covered landscape all looked the same after a while, and she began to understand how easy it would be to become lost forever in this wilderness. The camp, when they finally reached it, was larger than Sarah had expected. Nearly 40 lodges were arranged in a traditional circle, with smoke rising from each one into the grey afternoon sky. Dogs barked at their approach, and children peered out from behind lodge flaps to stare at the white prisoners. Women paused in their work to watch the procession, their faces showing various mixtures of curiosity, hostility, and something that might have been pity. Sarah was separated from the other prisoners immediately upon arrival. While the men were taken to one side of the camp and placed under guard, she was escorted to a lodge near the center of the circle. An older woman emerged from this lodge, a person who clearly held some position of authority within the tribe. She examined Sarah the way one might examine a horse at market, checking her hands, her teeth, her general health and condition. The woman spoke no English, but her intentions became clear through gestures and tone. Sarah was to be cleaned, fed, and given proper clothing. Whether this was preparation for adoption, trade, or something else entirely remained unclear. What was clear was that her fate would be decided by forces completely beyond her control, in a place where the rules she had lived by her entire life meant nothing at all. As night fell over the camp, Sarah sat in the lodge wearing the buckskin dress and moccasins that had been provided for her. Her own clothes had been taken away, and with them it seemed the last connection to the life she had been trying to build with Thomas. She thought about him waiting at Fort Benton, probably wondering why the stagecoach was delayed. He would have no way of knowing what had happened, no way of mounting any kind of rescue. The older woman, who Sarah would later learn was called Grandmother Willow by the children, brought her food and indicated that she should eat. The meal was unfamiliar but nourishing, some kind of meat stew with roots and berries. As Sarah ate, she became aware that she was being watched by several pairs of eyes from other parts of the lodge. Children, she realized, though they remained hidden in the shadows. Through gestures and patience, Grandmother Willow made Sarah understand that she was now part of this household, whether temporarily or permanently remained to be seen. But for now, this was where she would live. The old woman's manner was not unkind, but it was firm. Sarah was expected to contribute, to work, to make herself useful. This was not a place where anyone could simply exist without purpose. That first night, lying on a buffalo robe near the lodge fire, Sarah listened to the sounds of the camp settling down for sleep. Voices murmured in the language she did not understand. Dogs barked occasionally, and somewhere in the distance, someone was singing a song that sounded both mournful and beautiful. She thought about the letter from Thomas, probably lost forever now, along with all her other possessions from the stagecoach. She also thought about the look in the warrior leader's eyes when he first saw her. There had been something there beyond the simple evaluation of a prisoner's value. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation of some kind. Whatever it was, it had determined her current situation, and she could only hope that it might also determine her chances of survival. The lodge was warm, and the buffalo robe was surprisingly comfortable, but sleep came fitfully. Every sound from outside seemed potentially threatening, and Sarah found herself wondering what had become of the other prisoners. Were they somewhere nearby, or had they already been moved elsewhere? Were they even still alive? These questions circled through her mind like wolves around a campfire, never quite close enough to answer, but never far enough away to ignore. As dawn approached, Sarah heard movement throughout the camp, the sounds of daily life beginning again, of people rising to meet whatever challenges the day might bring. She had no idea what those challenges might be for her, but she understood that her old life was over. Whatever happened next, whatever person she became in order to survive, would be someone entirely different from the young woman who had boarded that stagecoach with dreams of marriage and a settled life. The transformation had already begun. Sarah's first full day in the Sioux camp began before sunrise when Grandmother Willow gently shook her awake. The old woman's weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as she gestured for Sarah to rise and follow her outside. The morning air was bitter cold, and Sarah's breath formed white clouds as she stepped out of the warm lodge into a world that seemed carved from ice and shadow. The camp was already bustling with activity, despite the early hour. Women were emerging from their lodges with water containers, heading toward a stream that ran along the eastern edge of the camp. Children scampered between the lodges, their laughter creating small puffs of vapor in the frigid air. Men stood in small groups, their voices low and serious, as they discussed matters that Sarah could not understand, but somehow knew were important. Grandmother Willow led Sarah to the stream, where she was expected to help with the morning water gathering. The other women acknowledged her presence with nods and curious glances, but none seemed hostile. If anything, there was a practical acceptance of her situation that Sarah found both comforting and unsettling. To these women, she was simply another person who needed to contribute to the survival of the group. The work was harder than anything Sarah had done in her life back in Ohio. Carrying water in heavy containers across uneven snow-covered ground required strength she was not sure she possessed. Her hands, soft from a life of relatively comfortable domesticity, quickly became raw and painful in the cold. But the other women showed her techniques for wrapping her hands, for carrying the containers more efficiently, for moving across the treacherous terrain without falling. As the days passed, Sarah began to recognize patterns in the camp's daily life. There was a rhythm to survival that she had never needed to understand before. Food was precious and nothing was wasted. Every person, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, had specific responsibilities. Work began with the sunrise and continued until darkness made it impossible to see. Rest was a luxury earned through contribution. Grandmother Willow proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. Through gestures, demonstrations, and the occasional word in broken English, she taught Sarah how to prepare hides, how to maintain the lodge fire, how to preserve meat for the lean times that would surely come. Sarah's hands, which had once been skilled at needlework and piano playing, learned to work with sinew and bone, with wood and stone. The children of the lodge were Sarah's most surprising allies. 3 of them lived in Grandmother Willow's household, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12 years old. They seemed to find Sarah's presence more fascinating than threatening, and they became her informal language teachers. They would point to objects and repeat the Lakota words until Sarah could approximate the sounds. They giggled at her mistakes but encouraged her attempts, and slowly, very slowly, Sarah began to understand fragments of the conversations happening around her. The oldest boy, who was called Running Wolf, took particular interest in teaching Sarah the skills she would need to survive. He showed her how to read the weather signs, how to find direction when landmarks were obscured by snow, how to move quietly through the camp without disturbing others. His lessons had an urgency to them that Sarah gradually came to understand. This was not idle kindness, but practical preparation for whatever trials lay ahead. Through Running Wolf's careful explanations, Sarah learned that the camp's situation was more precarious than she had initially realized. They were not simply a settled village, but a group of people constantly on the move, staying ahead of army patrols and hostile encounters with other tribes. Food was becoming scarce as game animals grew thin and wary in the harsh winter. Every mouth to feed was a calculation, every person a potential asset or liability. Sarah also learned the fate of her fellow passengers from the stagecoach. Bill Crawford had died from his arrow wound, infection setting in before proper treatment could be provided. Pete Morrison and Mr. Dare Henderson were being held in a different part of the camp, forced to work as laborers, but treated reasonably well as long as they proved useful. Mrs. Henderson's situation was more complicated. She had been adopted by a family that had recently lost a daughter, but her inability to adapt to camp life was causing problems. This information came to Sarah through careful listening and the patient translation efforts of Running Wolf, who seemed to understand that she needed to know these things. His motives were not entirely clear to her, but she sensed that he was preparing her for some kind of decision or change that would come soon. There was something about the way the adults looked at her, evaluated her progress, discussed her situation in voices too low for her to hear even if she could understand the words. The breakthrough in her situation came 3 weeks after her arrival, during one of the worst blizzards any of them had experienced in recent memory. The storm struck suddenly in the middle of the afternoon, turning the world into a wall of white that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Everyone in the camp was trapped in their lodges, burning precious fuel to stay warm while the wind howled like an angry spirit outside. It was during this storm that Sarah first heard the crying, a child's voice, high and desperate, coming from somewhere outside in the blizzard. At first, she thought she must be imagining it, that the wind was creating sounds that her worried mind was interpreting as human distress. But as she listened more carefully, she became certain that someone was out there in the storm, lost and in terrible danger. She tried to communicate her concerns to Grandmother Willow, but the old woman seemed to dismiss her worries. Through gestures and expressions, she indicated that everyone was accounted for, that Sarah was mistaken, that the storm was making her hear things that were not there, that the crying continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, always heartbreaking in its desperation. Finally, Sarah could stand it no longer. Despite Grandmother Willow's protests, despite the obvious danger, despite her own lack of experience in such conditions, she wrapped herself in every warm garment she could find and pushed out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, and the wind immediately tried to knock her off her feet. But she pressed forward, following the sound of the crying child. What she found, after nearly becoming lost herself in the swirling snow, was a small girl of perhaps 4 years old, half frozen and trapped under a fallen branch near the edge of the camp. The child had wandered away from her family's lodge and become disoriented when the storm struck. By the time Sarah found her, she was nearly unconscious from cold and exhaustion. Sarah's rescue of the child required every bit of strength and determination she possessed. Lifting the branch, gathering the barely conscious girl into her arms, and then finding her way back to the lodge through the blinding snow took nearly an hour of desperate effort. By the time she stumbled through the lodge entrance, both she and the child were in serious danger from exposure. The reaction to her arrival was immediate and dramatic. Grandmother Willow, who had been organizing a search party despite the dangerous conditions, took charge of caring for the rescued child with practiced efficiency. Other members of the lodge family rushed to help warm Sarah and treat the early signs of frostbite on her hands and feet. But it was the child's father who provided the most significant response. He was a man named Tall Bear, a respected warrior and hunter whose status in the tribe was considerable. When he arrived at the lodge and saw his daughter safe in Sarah's arms, his reaction was immediate and profound. Here was a white woman, a former prisoner, who had risked her own life to save his child when others had not even heard her cries for help. The debt he felt was not just personal but spiritual, binding him to Sarah in ways that went far beyond simple gratitude. Tall Bear's public acknowledgement of what Sarah had done changed her status in the camp immediately and dramatically. She was no longer a prisoner or even a reluctant adoptee, but someone who had proven herself worthy of respect and protection. The warrior's public declaration that Sarah had saved his most precious possession elevated her to a position that no white person had ever held in this particular band's history. The days following the rescue saw a transformation in how Sarah was treated by everyone in the camp. Where before there had been cautious acceptance, now there was genuine welcome. Women who had been politely distant began to seek her out, teaching her more advanced skills and including her in conversations that had previously been conducted outside her presence. Men nodded respectfully when they passed her, acknowledging her courage and her new status. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The woman who had boarded a stagecoach with dreams of conventional marriage and domestic comfort was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, more capable, more aware of what really mattered when survival was at stake. She was learning to think like someone whose life depended on reading weather signs and understanding the subtle communications of people who lived constantly on the edge of catastrophe. The child she had rescued, whose name was Little Dove, became attached to Sarah with the fierce loyalty that children sometimes develop for those who have saved them. She followed Sarah through her daily tasks, chatted to her in Lakota that Sarah was increasingly able to understand, and defended her against any criticism from other children who might have questioned her white origins. Through Little Dove, Sarah learned more about tribal life than any formal teacher could have provided. As winter deepened and the camp prepared for the hardest months ahead, Sarah found herself thinking less and less about Thomas Hartwell and Fort Benton. The life she had been traveling toward seemed increasingly like something that had happened to a different person, someone she had known once but could barely remember now. The immediate demands of survival, the complex relationships within the tribe, the daily challenges of life on the frontier, had become her entire reality. She still hoped for eventual freedom, still dreamed of returning to some version of the civilized world she had known. But those dreams were becoming less urgent, less central to her daily existence. She was learning to live in the present moment, to find satisfaction in work well done, in skills mastered, in the respect earned through courage and competence. She was becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. The transformation was not complete, and it was not without cost. There were moments of grief for the life she had lost, moments of fear about what the future might hold, moments of loneliness that seemed almost overwhelming. But there were also moments of connection, of purpose, of strength that she had never known she possessed. She was becoming a person who could save a child from a blizzard, who could earn the respect of warriors, who could survive in conditions that would have killed the woman who had left Ohio just weeks before. The approaching spring of 1877 brought changes to the camp that Sarah could feel even before she fully understood them. The conversations between the men grew longer and more intense. Messengers arrived from other bands with increasing frequency. Their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold weather. Women began preparing travel supplies with an urgency that suggested permanent departure rather than temporary relocation. Sarah's language skills had improved dramatically over the winter months, and she could now follow most conversations if she listened carefully. What she heard filled her with a growing sense of unease. The United States Army was mounting a massive campaign to force all remaining free tribes onto reservations. General Nelson Miles was moving troops into the territory with orders to capture or kill any Native Americans who refused to surrender. The freedom that these people had known for generations was coming to an end. The debates within the camp leadership were intense and sometimes heated. Some argued for surrender, believing that resistance would only lead to the complete destruction of their people. Others insisted that death was preferable to the slow starvation and cultural annihilation they had witnessed on the reservations. A few held out hope that they could continue to evade the army by moving deeper into the wilderness, perhaps joining with other bands to create a force too large for the soldiers to defeat. Sarah found herself in an increasingly complicated position as these discussions unfolded. Her knowledge of white culture and military tactics made her valuable to the tribal leaders who were trying to understand their enemies' likely strategies. At the same time, her presence in the camp represented a potential liability. If they were captured, having white prisoners might be seen as evidence of hostility that could justify harsh treatment. If they continued to run, she might slow them down or require resources they could not spare. Tall Bear, whose daughter Sarah had saved during the blizzard, became her strongest advocate during the council meetings where her fate was debated. His argument was simple and powerful. Sarah had proven her loyalty through actions, not words. She had risked her life for one of their children when she had no obligation to do so. She had adapted to their way of life with courage and determination. She had earned the right to be considered one of them, regardless of the color of her skin. But not everyone was convinced by Tall Bear's arguments. Some of the older warriors remembered too many betrayals by white people to trust any of them completely. Some of the younger men argued that keeping Sarah endangered the entire band for the sake of one person's gratitude. The discussions went on for days, sometimes growing so heated that Sarah worried they might lead to violence within the group. The resolution came in a way that none of them had expected. A small patrol of cavalry soldiers stumbled across one of their hunting parties about 10 miles from the main camp. The encounter was brief but violent. 2 warriors were killed before the soldiers were driven off, but their escape meant that the army now knew the approximate location of the band. They had perhaps 2 days before, a much larger force would arrive to surround and capture them. In the frantic preparation for immediate departure, Sarah's status became secondary to simple survival. Everyone who could walk would have to keep up with the group as they moved into even more remote territory. Everyone would have to carry their own supplies and contribute to the common defense. There was no time for philosophical debates about loyalty or belonging. There was only the immediate necessity of staying ahead of the soldiers who wanted to destroy their way of life forever. The march that followed was the most difficult thing Sarah had ever experienced. The band moved constantly, even through the nights, stopping only for brief rests when exhaustion made it impossible to continue. Food was scarce and had to be rationed carefully. Water was sometimes available only from streams that required dangerous detours to reach. The weather remained bitterly cold, and several of the older people in the group began to show signs of serious illness. Sarah's role during this desperate journey evolved naturally rather than through any formal decision. Her nursing skills, limited though they were, became valuable when people fell ill or were injured during the difficult travel. Her knowledge of white military thinking helped the scouts plan routes that were less likely to intersect with army patrols. Her physical strength, developed over months of hard work in the camp, allowed her to help others when they faltered. But it was her relationship with the children that proved most important during the hardest parts of the journey. Little Dove, still devoted to the woman who had saved her life, helped rally the other children when their spirits flagged. The games and songs Sarah taught them from her own childhood provided distraction during the worst moments of fear and exhaustion. Her presence gave them something familiar to cling to when everything else in their world seemed to be falling apart. The most serious test of Sarah's commitment came 3 weeks into their flight when they encountered another band of Sioux, who had been fleeing from army patrols for even longer than they had. This group was led by a war chief named Red Cloud Bear, a man whose reputation for both courage and ruthlessness was known throughout the territory. His band was larger but also more desperate, having lost many people to disease and military action over the winter. Red Cloud Bear's initial response to discovering white prisoners among Tall Bear's people was immediate and uncompromising. As far as he was concerned, Sarah and the other surviving white captives represented nothing but danger to all of them. His solution was simple and brutal. Kill them all immediately and leave their bodies where pursuing soldiers would find them. This would eliminate any possibility of the whites being rescued and used to guide army forces to their location. The confrontation between the two chiefs was public and angry. Red Cloud Bear argued that sentiment had no place in decisions affecting the survival of their people. Every extra mouth to feed, every person who slowed their movement, every potential source of information for their enemies, was a luxury they could not afford. Tall Bear countered that honor demanded they protect those who had proven themselves loyal, regardless of their origins. The debate drew in other leaders from both bands and threatened to split the combined groups at the worst possible time. Sarah listened to these discussions with growing dread, understanding enough of the language to know that her life hung in the balance. But what disturbed her most was not the possibility of her own death, but the realization of how much she had come to care about these people and their struggle. The thought of being separated from Little Dove, from Grandmother Willow, from the community that had become her world, was almost unbearable. The decision was finally made in the traditional way, through a council of the senior warriors from both bands. Sarah was called to speak for herself, to explain why she should be allowed to live when her presence endangered everyone else. She had never spoken publicly in Lakota before, and she knew that her words would determine not only her fate, but possibly the unity of the two bands that needed each other to survive. Standing before the circle of warriors, Sarah spoke from her heart about what she had learned during her months with the people. She talked about the courage she had witnessed, the generosity that had been shown to her even when resources were scarce, the wisdom of living in harmony with the land rather than trying to conquer it. She acknowledged that she would always be white in her appearance, but argued that loyalty and courage were not determined by the color of someone's skin. Then she made a proposal that surprised everyone, including herself. If the council truly believed that her presence endangered the group, she would leave voluntarily. She would take minimal supplies and travel alone toward the Canadian border, where she had heard that some refugees had found sanctuary. She would never reveal the location of the bands or provide information to army forces that might pursue them, but she would not ask them to risk their lives to protect hers if they truly believed she was a liability. The response to her offer was immediate and emotional. Little Dove burst into tears and ran to her side, wrapping her small arms around Sarah's waist and declaring that she would go too if Sarah left. Other children joined in the protest, and several of the women began arguing loudly with their husbands about the wisdom of sending anyone away in such dangerous conditions. Even some of the warriors seemed moved by Sarah's willingness to sacrifice herself for the group's safety. Red Cloud Bear, who had been Sarah's strongest opponent, studied her for a long moment after her speech. Then he asked her a question that went to the heart of the entire debate. If army soldiers captured her, would she help them find the bands in exchange for her freedom? Would she guide them to the camps, translate their demands, assist in negotiations that might save white lives at the cost of native lives? Sarah's answer was immediate and unequivocal. She would die before helping soldiers harm people who had shown her kindness and accepted her as family. She had seen enough of both worlds to know which one valued the things she had come to believe were most important. Honor, loyalty, courage, community, and respect for the natural world were not white virtues or native virtues, but human virtues. She had found them in abundance among these people, and she would not betray that gift for any promise of safety or comfort. The council's deliberation lasted through the night, but when morning came, the decision was unanimous. Sarah would remain with the band, not as a prisoner or a tolerated burden, but as a full member of the community. Red Cloud Bear himself performed the brief ceremony that marked her official adoption into the tribal family. From that moment forward, she would be known as Braveheart Woman, a name that honored both her courage in saving Little Dove and her willingness to risk everything for the people she had come to love. The combined bands continued their flight toward the Canadian border, with Sarah now fully integrated into their survival strategy. Her unique knowledge of both cultures made her an important advisor as they planned their route and considered their options. Her determination to protect the children had earned her the fierce loyalty of the camp's mothers. Her proven willingness to sacrifice for the common good had won the respect of even the most skeptical warriors. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah had finally found the sense of belonging that she had been seeking without realizing it. The conventional life she had been traveling toward in Fort Benton seemed like something from a dream now, pleasant, but ultimately shallow compared to the depth of commitment required by her current situation. She had become someone she could never have imagined back in Ohio, someone whose worth was measured not by appearance or social connections, but by courage and contribution to the community's welfare. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Always staying ahead of the military forces that sought to destroy their way of life forever, Sarah understood that her transformation was complete. She was no longer a white woman living among Native Americans, but simply a person who had found her place in the world and would fight to protect it against all threats. The journey that had begun with a stagecoach bound for Fort Benton had led her to a destination she had never imagined, and she would not trade that destination for anything the civilized world might offer. The Canadian border was only 3 days away when the crisis struck that would test everything Sarah had learned about courage, loyalty, and the bonds that hold a community together. The combined bands had been moving through increasingly difficult terrain, following deer paths and stream beds that offered concealment from the army patrols that seemed to be everywhere. Everyone was exhausted. Supplies were running dangerously low, and several of the elderly people were showing signs of serious illness that required rest they could not afford to take. It was during the second night of what they hoped would be their final push to freedom that the fever struck little Dove. Sarah woke to find the child burning with heat, her breathing rapid and shallow, her small body racked with chills despite the warmth of the lodge. Grandmother Willow's face showed the grim recognition of someone who had seen this particular sickness before and understood its implications. The illness spread quickly through the camp, affecting primarily the children and the elderly. Within 2 days, nearly a dozen people were seriously ill, and 3 of the oldest members of the band had died. The traditional medicines and healing ceremonies seemed powerless against whatever disease had found them. Worse, the sick could not travel, which meant the entire group was trapped in one location while Army scouts grew closer each day. Sarah's limited knowledge of white medicine became crucial as the crisis deepened. She had helped care for sick relatives back in Ohio and remembered some of the treatments that had proven effective against various fevers and respiratory ailments. But her supplies were limited to what could be found in the wilderness, and many of the remedies she might have used were simply not available. She did what she could with willow bark tea for fever reduction and steam treatments for breathing problems, but she knew that several of the patients needed medicines that could only be obtained from white settlements. The debate about what to do split the leadership of the combined bands. Some argued that they had to continue moving regardless of who could not keep up, harsh as that choice might be. The survival of the group had to take precedence over the lives of individuals, no matter how painful that decision might be. Others insisted that abandoning their sick would destroy the very values they were fighting to preserve. Red Cloud Bear found himself torn between his responsibilities as a military leader and his obligations as a member of a community. It was Tall Bear who proposed the solution that would place Sarah at the center of the most dangerous mission of her life. There was a small white settlement called Cedar Falls, about 15 miles to the south, a trading post and way station that served travelers heading west. It was too small to have a military presence, but it would have medical supplies and possibly even a doctor. If someone could reach the settlement, obtain the necessary medicines, and return without being detected, they might be able to save the lives of those who were dying. The plan was incredibly risky, for obvious reasons. Anyone attempting to approach a white settlement would face immediate suspicion and possible violence. Native Americans would be shot on sight in the current climate of fear and hostility. White men from the bands would be recognized as army deserters or outlaws and arrested immediately. But a white woman, especially one who could speak English fluently and convincingly, might be able to pose as a traveler in need of assistance. Sarah understood the implications of the mission before anyone had to explain them to her. If she was caught with stolen medicines, she would be arrested and probably hanged as an outlaw. If she was recognized as one of the missing stagecoach passengers, she would be held as a witness and forced to reveal the location of the bands. If she was simply unlucky enough to encounter the wrong people at the wrong time, she could be killed as a suspected spy or collaborator. But there was more at stake than just her own safety. Little Dove was among the sickest of the children, and her fever was rising despite everything Sarah had tried to do for her. Grandmother Willow, who had become like a mother to Sarah, was also showing early signs of the illness. The thought of losing either of them was unbearable. But the thought of losing them when medicine that could save them was available just a few hours away was even worse. The preparation for the mission took most of the night. Sarah had to be transformed back into a convincing white woman, something that proved more difficult than anyone had expected. Months of outdoor living had darkened her skin and changed her posture. Her hands were rough and scarred from hard work. Her hair had grown wild and was now braided in the native style. Even her facial expressions had changed, reflecting the constant alertness required by life on the frontier. The women of the band worked together to create a believable disguise. They washed the war paint and grease from Sarah's skin, unbraided her hair and styled it in a more conventional manner, and dressed her in clothing that had been salvaged from various sources over the months. The result was not entirely convincing. but it might pass casual inspection if Sarah was careful about how she presented herself. The most difficult part of the preparation was emotional rather than practical. Little Dove was too sick to fully understand what was happening, but she sensed that Sarah was leaving and became increasingly agitated. Her small hands clutched at Sarah's clothes as she prepared to go, and her fever-bright eyes seemed to be pleading for reassurance that could not honestly be given. Sarah's promises to return soon felt hollow, even as she spoke them, because they both knew how many things could go wrong. Tall Bear insisted on providing an escort for the most dangerous part of the journey. 2 young warriors would accompany Sarah to within a mile of the settlement, then wait for her return. If she was not back within 2 days, they would assume she had been captured or killed and would report that fact to the bands. The mission would be considered a failure, and other arrangements would have to be made for dealing with the medical crisis. The ride to Cedar Falls took Sarah through country that was both beautiful and treacherous. Spring was beginning to assert itself despite the lingering winter weather, and the landscape showed patches of green among the snow and mud. But every ridge could hide army scouts, every stream crossing could be an ambush point, and every mile traveled increased the risk of discovery by hostile forces. When they finally reached the hills overlooking the settlement, Sarah was struck by how small and vulnerable it appeared. Maybe a dozen buildings clustered around a crossroads, with smoke rising from several chimneys and a few people visible, moving between the structures. It looked like the kind of place where everyone would know everyone else, where strangers would be immediately noticed and questioned. Her chances of completing the mission successfully seemed impossibly small. The warriors who had escorted her wished her luck with the formality of people who did not expect to see her again. Their faces showed the stoic acceptance of loss that had become necessary for survival in these times. Too many good people had died or disappeared for anyone to waste energy on hope that could not be backed up with practical action. Sarah's mission was worth attempting, but it was not worth grieving over if it failed. The walk into Cedar Falls was the longest mile of Sarah's life. Every step took her farther from the people who had become her family, and closer to a world where she would have to convince suspicious strangers that she was someone she no longer felt herself to be. The white woman from Ohio who had boarded a stagecoach months ago seemed like a character from a story she had heard once but could barely remember. The person walking into the settlement was someone entirely different. Her story, when she finally had to tell it, was a carefully constructed mixture of truth and fiction. She was a traveler whose party had been attacked by Indians several days ago. She had escaped on foot but had become lost and was now suffering from exposure and exhaustion. She needed medical supplies for herself and information about how to reach the nearest army post where she could report the attack and seek protection. The response from the settlement's residents was everything Sarah had hoped for and feared. They were sympathetic to her plight and eager to help someone who had survived an Indian attack. They were also intensely curious about the details of her experience and frustrated by her apparent inability to provide useful information about the location and size of the war party that had attacked her. Their questions grew more pointed as the day went on. The trading post owner, a man named Samuel McKenna, had medical supplies but wanted to know exactly what Sarah needed them for. Her explanation that she was still suffering from injuries sustained during her escape satisfied him initially, but his wife was more observant and began to notice inconsistencies in Sarah's story. The type of injuries she described did not match the physical evidence they could observe. Her knowledge of the terrain seemed too detailed for someone who claimed to have been wandering lost for several days. Sarah managed to purchase laudanum for pain relief, quinine for fever treatment, and several other medicines that she hoped would help combat the illness ravaging the bands. But she could tell that her presence was creating more suspicion rather than less as time went on. People were beginning to whisper among themselves, and she noticed that someone had quietly ridden out of town in the direction of the nearest army outpost. The crisis came when she was preparing to leave the settlement. A child in the trading post began crying with the particular sound that every mother learns to recognize as serious distress rather than simple fussiness. Without thinking, Sarah moved immediately to help, her hands automatically checking for fever, her voice switching to the soothing Lakota words she had learned to use with Little Dove. The reaction from the child's parents was immediate and electric. Mrs. McKenna grabbed her baby away from Sarah's hands as if she'd been touched by something poisonous. Her husband reached for the rifle he kept behind the counter, his face showing the kind of fear that could quickly turn to violence. Other people in the store began moving toward the doors, ready to either flee or fight depending on what happened next. Sarah realized that her carefully constructed disguise had crumbled in an instant of unguarded compassion. The confrontation that followed tested every lesson Sarah had learned about survival and deception over the past months. She had to convince people who were already suspicious and frightened that she was not a threat to their community. She had to explain her knowledge of Indian customs without admitting that she had been living among Native Americans for months. Most importantly, she had to get out of the settlement with the medicines before someone decided that shooting her was the safest course of action. Her explanation was another careful mixture of truth and fiction. She had indeed been captured by Indians after the stagecoach attack, but she had managed to escape after only a few days in captivity. Her knowledge of their language came from listening carefully during that captivity, trying to understand what they planned to do with her. Her reaction to the crying child was simply the instinctive response of someone who had recently been terrified by the sound of distressed children in an Indian camp. The story might have been believed if Sarah had been more careful about other details of her performance. But months of living as Braveheart Woman had changed more about her than just her language skills. Her posture, her way of moving, her unconscious habits all reflected her adaptation to a different culture. She stood like someone accustomed to watching for danger, moved like someone who expected to have to run or fight at any moment, and looked at her surroundings with the constant alertness of someone whose survival depended on reading subtle signs of threat or opportunity. Samuel McKenna was a man who had spent years dealing with people on the frontier, and he recognized the signs of someone who was not entirely what they claimed to be. His solution was typically practical. Sarah could take the medicine she had purchased and leave immediately, or she could wait for the army patrol that had been summoned and explain her situation to trained interrogators. The choice was hers, but she had about 10 minutes to make it. Sarah's escape from Cedar Falls with the precious medicines became a desperate race against time and pursuit. She could hear horses behind her within an hour of leaving the settlement, and she knew that her carefully constructed story had finally collapsed under the weight of too many suspicious details. The army patrol that McKenna had summoned was closing in, and her only advantage was her knowledge of the terrain and the head start provided by the trading post owner's ultimatum. The two warriors who had escorted her to the settlement were waiting at the predetermined rendezvous point, their faces grim with the understanding that everything had gone wrong. The sound of pursuing horses was clear to all of them, and the number of riders suggested a force large enough to be a serious threat to the bands, even if they had not been weakened by illness and exhaustion. The mission to save the sick had potentially doomed everyone. The ride back toward the camp was a nightmare of speed and fear that pushed both horses and riders beyond their normal endurance. Sarah clutched the bag of medicines against her chest like a talisman, knowing that these supplies represented the only hope for Little Dove and the others who lay dying while she struggled to reach them. Behind them, the pursuit grew closer, the soldiers having advantages in both numbers and equipment that made capture seem inevitable. It was during this desperate flight that Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her life. When they reached a point where the trails split, one path leading toward the bands and safety, the other toward a rocky canyon that offered concealment but no escape, she chose the canyon. Her escorts protested frantically, knowing that she was choosing certain capture over possible survival, but Sarah was adamant. She would draw the pursuit away from the people she had come to love, even if it cost her everything. Her final instructions to the two warriors were delivered in the formal Lakota she had learned for important occasions. They were to take the medicines to Grandmother Willow immediately. They were to tell Tall Bear that Braveheart Woman had kept her promise to protect the band even unto death. Most importantly, they were to tell Little Dove that her white mother loved her more than life itself, and would watch over her always, even from the spirit world. The separation was brief but heartbreaking. The warriors understood the necessity of Sarah's sacrifice, but they also knew that they were abandoning someone who had become truly one of their people. Their faces showed the grief of men who had lost too many friends and family members to the wars that seemed destined to destroy everything they valued. Sarah's willingness to die for the band placed her in the company of the greatest heroes of their oral tradition. Alone in the canyon with the sound of approaching soldiers echoing off the rocky walls, Sarah prepared for what she assumed would be the last moments of her life. She had no weapons beyond a small knife, no real hope of escape, and no illusions about what would happen to someone caught providing aid to hostile Indians. But she also felt a strange peace that came from knowing she had lived according to the values she had learned during her months with the band. The soldiers who found her were led by a young lieutenant named James Morrison, who had been pursuing Indian raiders for 6 months without ever engaging them in direct combat. His frustration with the elusive enemy had been building steadily, and discovering a white woman who had obviously been collaborating with hostiles seemed like an opportunity to finally achieve something meaningful. His questions were aggressive and his manner threatened violence if he did not receive satisfactory answers. Sarah's response to the interrogation was to remain completely silent. She would not reveal the location of the bands, would not describe their numbers or capabilities. would not provide any information that could be used to harm people who had shown her nothing but kindness and acceptance. Her silence was not defiant but rather peaceful, the quiet dignity of someone who had made their choice and would accept the consequences. Lieutenant Morrison's patience with uncooperative prisoners was limited, especially when he suspected that the information she possessed could prevent future attacks on white settlements. His threats escalated from imprisonment to execution, but Sarah's resolve never wavered. She had seen enough of both worlds to know which one had offered her the opportunity to become the best version of herself, and she would not betray that gift for any promise of mercy or comfort. The standoff might have continued until Morrison's frustration led to violence, but it was interrupted by the arrival of someone neither of them had expected. Tall Bear appeared at the mouth of the canyon with a small group of warriors, not to rescue Sarah, but to negotiate for her life. His presence turned a simple case of capturing a collaborator into a complex diplomatic situation that the young lieutenant was not prepared to handle. Tall Bear's proposal was straightforward, and offered Morrison something that military commanders had been seeking for months. The band would surrender peacefully and accept transport to the designated reservation in exchange for Sarah's freedom and safe passage to whatever destination she chose. No more running, no more raids, no more cat-and-mouse games across the wilderness. Complete capitulation in exchange for the life of one woman who had proven her worth through courage and sacrifice. The negotiation that followed was conducted in 3 languages, with Sarah serving as translator between the Lakota-speaking warriors and the English-speaking soldiers. Her role placed her in the impossible position of facilitating the surrender of people she loved to a government she had come to distrust. Every word she spoke brought the band closer to the reservation life that meant the end of everything they had been fighting to preserve. But it was during this translation work that Sarah finally understood the true nature of the choice Tall Bear was offering her. He was not simply trading his people's freedom for her life, but giving her the opportunity to choose between the 2 worlds she had inhabited. She could return to white civilization with a story that would make her famous, or she could accompany the band to the reservation and share whatever fate awaited them there. The decision was entirely hers to make. The debate within the band about Sarah's future was brief but intense. Some argued that she should take the opportunity to return to her own people, that she had already sacrificed enough for people who were not her blood relatives. Others insisted that she had become too valuable to lose, that her skills as a translator and cultural mediator would be essential in dealing with reservation officials. A few suggested that the choice should not be theirs to make at all. Little Dove, weakened by illness but determined to have her voice heard, provided the perspective that cut through all the adult complexities. She approached Sarah with the direct honesty that children bring to important questions, and asked simply whether her white mother planned to abandon her now that the soldiers had come. The question was not accusatory, but genuinely curious, as if the child could not imagine why anyone would choose to leave family behind. Sarah's answer came from a place deeper than rational thought or careful planning. She knelt down to Little Dove's level and explained in careful Lakota that some choices were not really choices at all, but simply the recognition of truths that had been obvious all along. She belonged with the people who had accepted her when she was lost, who had taught her what courage really meant, who had shown her that family was created by love and loyalty rather than blood and tradition. The formal surrender of the band took place the next morning with ceremonies that acknowledged the dignity of both sides, even as they marked the end of the old way of life. Tall Bear presented his weapons to Lieutenant Morrison with the gravity of someone performing a sacred ritual. The warriors followed his example, laying down rifles and knives that had been passed down through generations. The women and children gathered their few remaining possessions and prepared for the journey to the reservation that would become their new prison. Sarah's transformation back into a white woman was now complete, but not in the way anyone might have expected when her captivity began. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who had boarded a stagecoach with romantic dreams of frontier marriage, nor was she simply a white person who had learned to live among Indians. She had become something entirely new, a bridge between worlds that usually remain separate, someone who belonged fully to both cultures and neither. The journey to the reservation took 2 weeks and was marked by the kind of bureaucratic cruelties that characterized the government's Indian policy. Families were separated, personal possessions were confiscated, and traditional practices were forbidden. Sarah watched the systematic destruction of everything she had come to value and understood that her real education in American history was just beginning. Her role as translator became crucial during the processing at the reservation, where officials needed to catalog prisoners, assign housing, and establish work details. Sarah found herself in the position of explaining to her adopted family why they could no longer practice their religion, why children would be taken away to boarding schools, Why men who had been warriors and hunters would now be expected to become farmers on land that could barely support subsistence agriculture. The reservation officials were puzzled by Sarah's presence and uncertain about how to categorize someone who was clearly white but insisted on being treated as a member of the Sioux band. Their solution was typically bureaucratic. She was classified as a voluntary resident who could leave at any time but chose to remain for purposes of cultural translation and community stability. The designation gave her slightly more freedom than the other residents, but also marked her as someone who required special surveillance. As months passed and the harsh realities of reservation life became clear to everyone, Sarah's unique position allowed her to become an advocate for her adopted people in ways that would have been impossible for Native Americans themselves. She could write letters to newspapers describing conditions on the reservation, could speak to visiting officials in terms they understood, could navigate the complex bureaucracy that controlled every aspect of daily life for the residents. But perhaps her most important role was simply maintaining hope and cultural continuity during a period designed to destroy both. She told Little Dove and the other children stories from their own tradition that they were forbidden to hear from their elders. She helped preserve knowledge of traditional medicines and healing practices that officials tried to suppress. She served as a living example that it was possible to honor both heritage and adaptation without losing one's essential identity. The years that followed brought changes that no one could have predicted when Sarah first stepped off that stagecoach bound for Fort Benton. The frontier that had seemed so vast and wild gradually filled with towns and farms and railroads. The Indian Wars officially ended, though the Cultural War continued in subtler forms. Sarah aged from a young woman into a mature adult who had experienced more of life's complexities than most people encounter in several lifetimes. Through it all, she remained with the people who had become her true family, sharing their struggles and celebrating their occasional victories. When Little Dove grew up and married a young man from another band, Sarah was there to help with the wedding preparations according to traditional customs. When Grandmother Willow died peacefully in her sleep after many years of reservation life, Sarah was there to help prepare the body and comfort the grieving family members. The choice Sarah had made in that canyon years earlier proved to be not a single decision, but a lifetime commitment to living according to values that transcended the artificial boundaries between cultures and races. She had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite fear. That loyalty was not blind obedience, but thoughtful dedication to those who had proven themselves worthy of love. That home was not a place, but a community of people who chose to care for each other regardless of the obstacles they faced. When Sarah finally died, many years later, she was mourned by people from both worlds she had inhabited. The white community remembered her as a brave woman who had survived captivity and chosen to dedicate her life to helping those less fortunate. The Native community honored her as Braveheart Woman, someone who had proven that the bonds of family and loyalty could transcend any difference of birth or background. Her story became part of the oral tradition of the band, told to children as an example of how one person's courage could change the course of many lives. The lesson was not about the superiority of one culture over another, but about the human capacity to grow beyond the limitations of birth and circumstance. Sarah Mitchell had begun her journey as one person and ended it as someone entirely different, someone who had discovered that the most important destinations are often ones we never knew we were seeking.